The carriage wheels stopped turning, and Evelyn Ashworth's hands went cold inside her gloves. Tonight she would marry a man she had spoken to only twice in her whole life. The candles in the chapel windows glowed like small warnings, and somewhere behind those thick stone walls, Edmund Harcourt, the Earl of Ravenswood, was waiting to become her husband. 6 weeks earlier, her father had called her into his study and told her the truth without softening a single word. The Ashworth family was drowning in debt. Their house, their land, even the food on their table depended on one thing now, a marriage that would save them all. Lord Gerald Ashworth had not asked his daughter what she wanted. He had simply told her what needed to happen, and Evelyn, raised to obey, had nodded and said yes. She remembered that night clearly, sitting alone in her room afterward, staring at the small fire in her hearth. She was 22 years old, and she had always imagined that love, even a small, quiet kind of love, would find her one day. Instead, her future had been decided over brandy and old letters between two men who cared more about money than her happiness. The Earl of Ravenswood was known across the county, though not for warmth. People spoke of him carefully, almost cautiously, as though his name carried a weight they did not fully understand. He was wealthy beyond question, his estate one of the finest in the region, his family line old and respected. But there was something behind his eyes, people said, something that never quite settled. A housemaid who once worked briefly at Ravenswood Manor told Evelyn's own maid that the Earl rarely smiled, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. Evelyn tried not to let these stories frighten her. She told herself that reputations were often exaggerated, twisted by gossip and boredom. Perhaps the Earl was simply a serious man, burdened by responsibility, the way many men of his position were. She held onto that thought like a small candle in a dark room, hoping it might be enough to light the path ahead of her. Her mother had died when Evelyn was 16, leaving behind a single ring, a delicate band of gold with a small sapphire stone, worn smooth from years of gentle touch. It was the only piece of real value the family still owned, and Evelyn had kept it hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed, refusing to let her father sell it even in their most difficult months. That ring was the last piece of her mother she had left, and she had promised herself long ago that she would wear it only on a day that truly mattered. Now, 3 days before her wedding, she took it out and held it under the candlelight, watching the small stone catch and scatter the glow. She decided quietly that she would wear it beneath her wedding ring, close to her skin, so that some part of her mother would be with her when she made her vows. The first meeting with Edmund happened at a formal dinner arranged by both families, 5 days before the wedding. Evelyn had spent hours preparing, her maid curling her hair, her stepmother fussing over the fit of her gown. She walked into the drawing room of Ravenswood Manor with her chin lifted, determined not to appear as frightened as she felt. Edmund stood near the fireplace when she entered, tall and composed, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to match the seriousness of his expression. He turned toward her, and for a moment their eyes met across the room. Evelyn searched his face for some sign of warmth, some flicker of curiosity about the woman he was about to marry. What she found instead was a careful blankness, like a door closed and locked from the inside. He crossed the room and bowed slightly, taking her hand in a polite, practiced motion. His fingers were cool against hers. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice low and even. "The pleasure is mine, my lord," she replied, offering a smile she hoped looked more confident than she felt. Dinner passed in careful conversation, the kind exchange between strangers who both knew they were being watched. Edmund asked polite questions about her interests, her family, her thoughts on the county's recent harvest. Evelyn answered each one thoughtfully, trying to find some thread of connection between them. But every time she asked him something personal, something that might reveal the man beneath the title, he redirected the conversation smoothly, like a skilled dancer avoiding a misstep. At one point, during a quiet lull in conversation, Evelyn noticed him glance toward the tall windows at the far end of the dining hall. His expression shifted for just a moment, something distant and pained crossing his features before he caught himself and returned his attention to his plate. She wanted to ask what he had been thinking about, but something told her not to. Whatever memory had passed through his mind in that instant was not meant for her. Later that evening, while the older members of both families discussed wedding arrangements over tea, Evelyn found herself alone in the manor's long hallway, studying the portraits that lined the walls. Generations of Harcourt ancestors stared down at her with stern, painted expressions. She paused in front of one particular painting, larger than the others, depicting a beautiful young woman with dark hair and bright, laughing eyes. There was something alive in that portrait, something that felt different from the formal stiffness of the others. "Excuse me," she said to a passing servant, an older woman carrying a tray of empty teacups. "Might I ask who this is?" The servant glanced at the painting, then quickly around the hallway, as though checking whether anyone else could hear. "That was Charlotte, my lady," she said quietly. "A dear friend of the family some years back. The painting has hung there a long while." Before Evelyn could ask anything more, the servant hurried away, leaving her alone with the portrait and a growing sense that there was a story here, one that no one seemed willing to tell her. That night, riding home in the carriage, Evelyn stared out at the passing countryside, turning the strange moment over in her mind. She thought of Edmund's distant expression at dinner, the way his eyes had drifted toward the window as though searching for something that wasn't there anymore. She thought of the portrait, of the servant's nervous glance, of the name Charlotte spoken so carefully, as though it were fragile. She told herself it did not matter. Whatever had happened before her arrival, whatever ghosts lived in the halls of Ravenswood Manor, she would find a way to build something new. She was not marrying for love, she reminded herself. She was marrying for duty, for her family, for the roof over her stepmother's head and the food on her younger brother's plate. If Edmund carried sadness with him, perhaps in time she could help ease it. Perhaps kindness, patience, and steadiness could accomplish what love alone could not. It was a hopeful thought, and she held on to it the way she had held on to so many hopeful thoughts in her short life. But somewhere beneath that hope, a small, quiet doubt had already begun to grow, small as a seed, waiting. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of fittings, flowers, and formal visits. Evelyn's stepmother, Constance, hovered over every detail with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though she understood better than anyone how much rested on this marriage succeeding. Evelyn's younger brother, Peter, only 12 years old, seemed the only person in the household who noticed her quiet unease. "You don't have to smile all the time, you know," he told her one afternoon, finding her alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular. "Even brides are allowed to look worried." Evelyn laughed softly, surprised by his perceptiveness. "I'm not worried," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I'm simply thinking." Peter studied her for a long moment, his young face serious beyond his years. "If he's unkind to you, you can always come home," he said. "I'll make sure of it." The words stayed with her long after Peter had run off to his lessons. She wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man Edmund truly was beneath the polished manners and careful distance. She wondered about Charlotte, whoever she had been, and what had happened to make her name something spoken only in whispers. 2 days before the wedding, Evelyn's father called her once more into his study. He looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his shoulders slightly bent under a weight she suspected had little to do with age. "You understand what this marriage means for our family," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Evelyn nodded, though something in his tone made her uneasy. "I understand, father," she said. "I will do my part." He reached across the desk and took her hand, an unusual gesture of affection from a man who rarely showed such things. "I know I have asked much of you," he said quietly, "more than a father should ask of his daughter, but know that I am grateful and that I believe in time this will bring you a good life." Evelyn wanted to believe him. She wanted more than anything to walk into her wedding with hope instead of fear. But as she left his study that evening, she could not shake the image of Edmund's distant eyes, the portrait of the laughing dark-haired woman, and the servant's hurried, nervous silence. Whatever awaited her at Ravenswood Manor, she understood now that it was not simply a new home or a new title. It was a mystery, one that had already begun to unfold before she had even said her vows. And though she did not yet know it, the wedding night ahead of her would reveal far more than she had ever prepared herself for. As the carriage finally rolled to a stop outside the chapel on the morning of her wedding, Evelyn Ashworth took a steadying breath, touched the small ring hidden beneath her wedding dress, close to her heart, and stepped down into a future she could not yet see clearly. Somewhere inside those chapel doors, a man was waiting who carried secrets of his own, secrets that would soon change the course of both their lives forever. The wedding date drew closer with a speed that left Evelyn breathless. Every morning brought a new fitting, a new list of guests to review, a new decision about flowers or music that seemed to matter enormously to everyone except her. She moved through these days like a passenger in her own life, nodding when nodding was expected, smiling when a smile was required, all while a quiet unease continued to grow beneath her calm exterior. She could not stop thinking about the portrait of Charlotte. The name lingered in her mind at odd moments, during fittings, during meals, during the quiet minutes before sleep. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a stranger's painted face, foolish to let a servant's hurried words shape her feelings about a man she barely knew. Yet the curiosity would not leave her alone. 10 days before the wedding, Evelyn's Aunt Margaret came to visit from the coastal town of Halden Cove, where she had lived quietly since the death of her husband many years earlier. Margaret was Evelyn's mother's younger sister, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, known throughout the family for saying exactly what she thought regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it. "You look pale, my dear," Margaret said, settling into a chair in Evelyn's sitting room with the ease of someone who had visited 100 times before. A bride should glow, not fade. "I am simply tired," Evelyn replied, though she suspected her aunt saw straight through the excuse. Margaret studied her niece for a long moment, then set down her teacup with a soft clink. "Tell me about this Earl of yours," she said. "Not what the papers say, not what your father says. Tell me what you have seen with your own eyes." Evelyn hesitated, then found herself telling her aunt everything, the distant politeness, the strange moment during dinner when Edmund's eyes had drifted toward the window, the portrait of the laughing dark-haired woman named Charlotte, and the servant's nervous refusal to say more. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Evelyn finished, her aunt sat quietly for a moment, tapping one finger against the arm of her chair. "I have heard whispers of a Charlotte," she said finally. "Not confirmed, mind you, only whispers among people who like to talk. They say she was meant to marry the Earl once, years ago, before you were even old enough to be considered for such a match. They say something happened, something sudden, and she was never spoken of again in polite company." "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked, though part of her feared the answer. "That, my dear, I do not know," Margaret admitted, "and I would be careful asking directly. Grief has strange ways of settling into a household, and sometimes the kindest thing is to let sleeping matters rest, at least until you understand the ground you are standing on." Evelyn nodded slowly, though the advice did little to calm her racing thoughts. If anything, it deepened the mystery, giving it just enough shape to make it impossible to ignore. 2 days after her aunt's visit, Evelyn was invited to Ravenswood Manor once more, this time for a smaller, quieter dinner meant to allow the two families to finalize the last details of the ceremony. She arrived early, hoping for a few private moments to walk the gardens before the formal evening began. The head gardener, an elderly man named Walter, greeted her warmly as she wandered among the late-season roses. "You have a fine eye for gardens, my lady," he said, tipping his hat as she paused beside a bed of white flowers. "Thank you, Walter," she replied. "Everything here is beautifully kept. It must take a great deal of care." "The Earl insists on it," Walter said, straightening one of the stems with practiced hands. "Especially this section. He has never let us change it, not in all these years." Evelyn glanced around at the roses, noticing for the first time that they were arranged in a careful, deliberate pattern, almost like a small, private memorial. "Is there a reason," she asked carefully, "this particular section matters so much to him?" Walter's expression shifted, the same careful hesitation she had seen in the servant near the portrait. "That is not really my place to say, my lady," he said gently, "but I will tell you this. The Earl was not always as quiet as he is now. There was a time, not so long ago, when he laughed easily and spoke his mind freely. Something changed that. I could not tell you what exactly, but it changed him deeply." Evelyn thanked him and continued her walk alone, her mind spinning with questions she was too afraid to ask directly. She thought of the portrait again, of Charlotte's bright, laughing eyes, so different from the guarded stillness she had come to associate with Edmund. Whatever had happened between them, it had clearly left a mark that time had not yet erased. At dinner that evening, Evelyn found herself seated beside Edmund once more, their families filling the rest of the table with light conversation about wedding logistics and county news. She studied him more carefully this time, searching for the cracks beneath his composed exterior. He answered questions politely, laughed at appropriate moments, played his part with the practiced skill of a man who had learned long ago how to appear whole even when he was not. Partway through the meal, Evelyn gathered her courage and asked a question she had been holding back for days. "My lord," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear, "I noticed the roses in your garden are arranged with great care. Walter mentioned it was a section you hold dear. May I ask why?" Edmund's fork paused midway to his plate. For a moment, something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, like a door opening just wide enough to reveal a glimpse of what lay behind it before slamming shut again. "It is simply a garden, Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice carefully even. "Nothing more." She knew immediately that he was lying, but she also understood with a clarity that surprised her that pushing further would accomplish nothing except to close him off even more completely. She let the matter drop, returning her attention to her plate, though the weight of his brief, guarded reaction stayed with her for the rest of the evening. Later, as the families said their goodbyes and Evelyn prepared to leave, Edmund walked her to her carriage, an act of courtesy rather than warmth. As they stood together in the cool evening air, he spoke, his voice quieter and more hesitant than she had heard it before. "I know I have not been the most open companion these past weeks," he said, staring at some point past her shoulder rather than meeting her eyes directly. "I hope, in time, you will understand that it is not a reflection of my regard for you." Evelyn studied him carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the careful words. "I would like to understand you, my lord," she said honestly, "if you would allow it." Something in his expression softened just slightly before the familiar guarded look returned. "Perhaps in time," he said, opening the carriage door for her. "For now, let us simply prepare for the days ahead." She rode home that night turning his words over in her mind, searching for hope in the small opening he had offered while trying to ignore the doubt that continued to grow alongside it. She wanted desperately to believe that time and patience could heal whatever wound Charlotte's memory had left behind. She wanted to believe that the man walking beside her toward marriage was capable of choosing a new future, even if his past still held him tightly. The final days before the wedding passed in a rush of activity. Dressmakers made their last adjustments to her gown, a beautiful ivory creation embroidered with delicate silver thread along the sleeves and hem. Her stepmother fussed endlessly over seating arrangements and flower selections, while her father spent long hours locked away with his solicitor, finalizing the financial arrangements that had made this marriage necessary in the first place. Through it all, Evelyn found herself returning again and again to thoughts of Charlotte, to the careful roses in the garden, to the flicker of pain she had glimpsed in Edmund's eyes before he closed himself off once more. She did not know what she was walking into, not fully, but she understood now that her marriage would not simply be the joining of two families for financial convenience. It would be a journey into a household still shadowed by an unspoken grief, one she would somehow need to navigate if she hoped to build any kind of life for herself within those walls. The night before her wedding, Evelyn sat alone in her room, the small ring with the sapphire stone resting in her palm. She thought of her mother, gone now for 6 years, and wondered what advice she might have offered if she were still alive to give it. She thought of her father's tired eyes, of Peter's quiet promise to bring her home if things went wrong, of her aunt's careful warning about sleeping matters best left undisturbed. Finally, she thought of Edmund, of the brief softness in his expression as he had spoken to her beside the carriage, and of the deep sadness that seemed to live permanently behind his composed exterior. Whatever tomorrow brought, she decided, she would face it with as much strength and grace as she could manage. She slipped the ring onto a thin chain and fastened it around her neck, tucking it carefully beneath her nightgown, close to her heart, where it would remain hidden but present through whatever lay ahead. Sleep did not come easily that night. Evelyn lay awake for hours, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her, thinking of roses arranged like memorials and portraits hung with careful, deliberate placement, and a name spoken only in careful whispers. Somewhere across the county, in the halls of Ravenswood Manor, she wondered if Edmund lay awake as well, haunted by memories she could not yet fully understand, preparing himself for a wedding that would bind him to a woman who was not the one his heart still seemed to carry. When morning finally came, pale and golden through her window, Evelyn rose to begin the most important day of her life, still unaware of just how much that day would test everything she believed about duty, patience, and the quiet strength required to survive a broken heart she had not yet earned. The chapel bells rang across the county just after 9 in the morning, calling guests from every corner of the region toward the small stone church at the edge of Ravenswood land. Evelyn stood in a private room adjoining the chapel, watching her stepmother fuss over the final pins holding her veil in place, while her maid smoothed invisible wrinkles from the ivory silk of her gown. Through the thin wall, she could hear the low murmur of arriving guests, dozens of voices blending into a steady hum of anticipation. "You look beautiful, Evelyn," Constance said, stepping back to admire her work, her eyes glistening with something that might have been genuine emotion or simple relief that the marriage was finally happening. "This is everything we hoped for." Evelyn studied her own reflection in the tall mirror propped against the wall. The woman looking back at her seemed almost like a stranger, elegant and composed, dressed for a future that still felt uncertain despite all the careful planning. She touched the small chain hidden beneath her collar, feeling the familiar shape of her mother's ring pressed against her skin, and took a slow, steadying breath. Her father appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, dressed in his finest coat, looking older and more solemn than she had ever seen him. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his, studying her face with an expression she could not quite read. "Your mother would be proud of you today," he said quietly. "I only hope I have chosen wisely for you." Evelyn squeezed his hands gently. "Whatever comes, father," she said, "I will make the best of it. I promise you that." He nodded, though his eyes remained heavy with something like guilt, before offering his arm to lead her toward the chapel doors. The organ music swelled as the doors opened, and Evelyn found herself walking slowly down the aisle, past rows of familiar and unfamiliar faces, all turned toward her with expressions of polite admiration. At the front of the chapel, standing beside the altar, Edmund waited in formal black, his posture straight and controlled, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling calm. As Evelyn approached, their eyes met across the remaining distance, and for a brief moment she thought she saw something flicker behind his composed exterior, something that looked almost like fear. She reached the altar and took her place beside him, her father stepping back to join the gathered guests. The priest began the ceremony with familiar words about duty, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage, his voice steady and practiced from years of performing similar services. Evelyn listened, trying to focus on the significance of the moment, trying to push aside the small knot of anxiety that had settled in her chest since the previous night. When it came time for the vows, Edmund's voice was steady as he repeated the traditional words, promising to honor and protect her, to remain faithful through whatever circumstances life might bring. Evelyn watched his face carefully as he spoke, searching for sincerity, and found something that seemed genuine, even if it was tinged with an undercurrent of sadness she could not quite explain. When her turn came, she spoke her own vows clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet chapel, promising the same devotion and loyalty that tradition demanded. As she finished, Edmund reached for her hand to place the wedding ring upon her finger, and she noticed, for just an instant, that his fingers trembled slightly before he steadied them. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, and a soft murmur of approval rippled through the gathered guests. Edmund leaned forward to press a brief, formal kiss against her cheek, his lips cool against her skin, before straightening and turning to face the congregation with practiced composure. Evelyn stood beside him, newly married, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak she had not quite grown used to wearing. The reception that followed took place in the grand hall of Ravenswood Manor, transformed for the occasion with elaborate flower arrangements, long tables draped in fine linen, and enough food and wine to feed the entire county twice over. Evelyn moved through the crowd on Edmund's arm, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, playing her part with a grace that surprised even herself given the tangled uncertainty still churning beneath her calm exterior. Throughout the celebration, she noticed small things that others might have overlooked. Edmund's smile, while polite, rarely reached his eyes. His attention seemed to drift occasionally toward the tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens, the same direction, she realized with a small jolt, as the rose garden Walter had shown such careful devotion to maintaining. Whenever this happened, he would catch himself quickly, redirecting his focus to whoever stood before him with an apologetic smile that felt more habitual than heartfelt. During a quiet moment, while Edmund was engaged in conversation with a group of visiting dignitaries, Evelyn found herself standing near the edge of the hall beside an older woman she recognized as one of the senior household staff, a woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who served as the manor's housekeeper. "It is a beautiful celebration," Evelyn said politely, hoping to ease into conversation without seeming too forward. Mrs. Whitfield nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "The manor has not seen such festivity in many years, my lady," she said. "Not since before." "Before what?" Evelyn asked gently, though she suspected she already knew the direction the conversation was heading. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes flickered toward the eastern windows, toward the garden beyond, before returning to Evelyn's face. "Forgive me, my lady," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "It is not my place to speak of such things on your wedding day. I only meant that the household is glad to see happiness return to these halls, however it comes." Before Evelyn could press further, a group of guests approached, pulling Mrs. Whitfield away to attend to some minor detail regarding the arrangement of desserts. Evelyn was left standing alone for a moment, turning the housekeeper's careful, unfinished sentence over in her mind, the word before hanging in the air like an unanswered question. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the celebration continued with music and dancing, the guests growing more relaxed and jovial as wine flowed freely throughout the hall. Evelyn danced with her father, with Edmund's elderly uncle who served as the family's remaining senior relative, and finally with Edmund himself, his hand resting formally against her waist as they moved through the steps of a slow, traditional dance. "You have handled today beautifully," he said quietly as they danced, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I know this has not been an easy transition for you." Evelyn studied his face as they turned slowly around the dance floor. "It has not been easy for either of us, I think," she said carefully, watching for his reaction. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of surprise perhaps that she had spoken so directly. "No," he admitted quietly, "it has not." She wanted to ask him then, in that private moment amid the swirl of music and dancing guests, about Charlotte, about the rose garden, about whatever grief still lingered so heavily beneath his careful composure. But the dance ended before she could find the courage, and the moment passed, swallowed up by the demands of the celebration continuing around them. As evening deepened into night, the guests began their gradual departures, offering final congratulations and well wishes before making their way back to their carriages. Evelyn stood beside Edmund at the manor's entrance, thanking each guest personally, her feet aching from hours of standing and her mind exhausted from the constant effort of appearing composed and content. Finally, as the last carriage rolled away down the long drive, silence settled over the manor grounds. Evelyn turned to look at Edmund, standing beside her in the cooling evening air, and found him staring once again toward the eastern gardens, his expression distant and troubled in a way he seemed to have forgotten to hide. "Are you well, my lord?" she asked quietly. He blinked, seeming to return from wherever his thoughts had carried him, and offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Simply tired," he said. "It has been a long day." Mrs. Whitfield appeared then, informing them that everything had been prepared upstairs for the evening, her tone carefully professional despite the meaningful glance she exchanged with another senior servant standing nearby. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of nervousness rise within her, the reality of the night ahead settling heavily over the exhaustion of the long day. Edmund offered his arm, and together they climbed the grand staircase toward the private wing of the manor, passing beneath the watchful painted eyes of generations of Harcourt ancestors lining the walls. As they walked, Evelyn noticed that his pace seemed to slow the closer they came to the top of the stairs, his expression growing increasingly distant, his jaw tightening with what looked almost like dread rather than anticipation. They reached the door of the bridal chamber, a beautifully appointed room Evelyn had glimpsed only briefly during an earlier tour of the manor, decorated now with fresh flowers and soft candlelight in preparation for their wedding night. Edmund paused outside the door, his hand resting on the handle but not yet turning it. "I will join you shortly," he said, his voice strange and stiff. "There is a small matter I must attend to first." Evelyn nodded, though something in his tone sent a small chill through her despite the warmth of the evening. "Of course," she said softly. He opened the door for her, allowing her to step inside, before closing it gently behind her without following. Evelyn stood alone in the beautifully prepared room, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway, and felt, for the first time since her father had first told her of this marriage, a genuine and unshakable sense that something was deeply, terribly wrong. She moved toward the window and looked out over the darkening grounds, watching the last traces of sunset fade behind the distant tree line. Somewhere out there, in the vast and quiet estate that was now supposedly her home, her husband was attending to some unexplained matter on the very night he should have been beside her. She thought of the rose garden, of Charlotte's laughing portrait, of Mrs. Whitfield's unfinished sentence about happiness finally returning to these halls. As the candles burned lower and the manor settled into its nighttime quiet, Evelyn began to understand, with a growing sense of dread, that whatever secret Edmund carried within him was about to reveal itself in ways she had never anticipated. She sat down slowly on the edge of the grand bed, still dressed in her wedding gown, and began the long, uncertain wait for a husband who showed no sign of returning. The candles burned steadily lower as the hours passed, their soft light casting long, flickering shadows across the walls of the bridal chamber. Evelyn sat by the window for a long while, watching the darkness deepen over the grounds, listening for any sound of footsteps returning down the hallway. None came. She rose eventually and paced the room, her wedding gown rustling softly with each step, trying to convince herself that there was some reasonable explanation for Edmund's absence. Perhaps a matter concerning the estate had arisen, something urgent enough to require his immediate attention despite the late hour. Perhaps one of the tenant farmers had sent word of some emergency. She turned over every possibility she could imagine, searching for one that did not fill her with the growing dread settling steadily in her chest. Near midnight, a soft knock sounded at the door. Evelyn hurried toward it, her heart lifting with relief, expecting to find Edmund finally returned. Instead, she found Mrs. Whitfield standing in the hallway, a single candle in her hand, her expression carefully composed, but unable to fully hide the concern beneath it. "Forgive the intrusion, my lady," the housekeeper said quietly. "I wished to see if you required anything before I retired for the evening." Evelyn studied the older woman's face, searching for some hint of information. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said carefully, "do you know where my husband has gone?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the housekeeper's features before she answered. "I believe he rode out shortly after leaving you at the door, my lady," she said. "One of the stable hands mentioned seeing him take his horse toward the eastern road, though I could not say where he intended to go." "The eastern road," Evelyn repeated slowly, her mind immediately connecting the direction to the rose garden, to the windows he so often glanced toward, to whatever unspoken grief seemed to live in that particular corner of the estate. Mrs. Whitfield's expression softened with something that looked almost like pity. "I am certain he will return soon, my lady," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Please try to rest. I will send word immediately should he arrive." Evelyn thanked her and closed the door, though sleep felt impossibly distant given the churning uncertainty in her mind. She removed her veil and the elaborate pins holding her hair in place, letting it fall loosely around her shoulders, and eventually changed out of her wedding gown into a simple nightdress, though she left the small chain with her mother's ring firmly in place around her neck. The night stretched on in agonizing slowness. Evelyn tried lying down at one point, staring up at the ornate ceiling of the bridal chamber, listening to the quiet sounds of the settling house and the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the walls. Sleep would not come, not with her mind racing through every possible explanation, every fear, every small detail from the day that might have hinted at what was happening now. She thought of Edmund's trembling hands as he placed the wedding ring on her finger. She thought of his distant gaze toward the eastern gardens throughout the reception, of Mrs. Whitfield's unfinished sentence about happiness finally returning, of Walter's careful tending of that particular section of roses. Piece by piece, the fragments began arranging themselves into a picture she did not want to see clearly, yet could no longer ignore. Sometime after 2 in the morning, Evelyn rose from the bed and returned to the window, watching the empty grounds below, illuminated faintly by moonlight. The eastern road stretched away into darkness, empty and silent, offering no sign of a returning rider. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and continued her vigil, refusing to give in to the exhaustion pulling at her eyes, as though her continued waiting might somehow will him back through the door. The first pale hints of dawn began touching the horizon around 5 in the morning, and still, Edmund had not returned. Evelyn sat in a chair near the window now, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind strangely calm despite the long night of uncertainty. Somewhere in the quiet hours before sunrise, the frantic worry that had consumed her had settled into something quieter, something closer to a painful, growing clarity. She understood now, with a certainty that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that whatever grief Edmund carried, whatever memory of Charlotte still held such power over him, it had proven stronger than his promise to her. He had left her alone on their wedding night, chosen the pull of his past over the vows he had spoken only hours before. Whatever happiness Mrs. Whitfield had hoped might finally return to Ravenswood Manor, it seemed, was not meant to arrive through Evelyn. By 6 in the morning, sunlight had fully broken across the grounds, golden and warm despite the coldness settling in Evelyn's chest. She rose from her chair, moving with a strange, deliberate calm, and walked to the small writing desk positioned near the window. She had noticed it the previous evening, part of the room's careful preparation, complete with fine paper and ink should the new lady of the house wish to write letters. She sat for a long moment, staring at the blank page, before finally understanding that no letter she could write would adequately capture what she needed to say. Some things, she realized, were better communicated through action than through words. She removed the wedding ring from her finger first, studying it briefly in the morning light, a beautiful piece of gold that had been placed there by trembling hands only hours before. Then she reached beneath her nightdress and unclasped the thin chain holding her mother's sapphire ring, the one piece of her old life she had carried into this new one with such hope. For a long moment she held both rings in her palm, feeling their weight, remembering the promises each had once represented. Then, with steady hands, she rose and walked toward the bed, placing both rings gently upon the untouched pillow where Edmund should have rested beside her. She arranged them carefully, side by side, a silent message that required no written words to explain. Evelyn dressed quickly then, choosing simple, practical clothing from the small selection her maid had packed for the early days of the marriage, before movement into the larger wardrobe planned for later in the week. She packed a single small trunk with only the essentials, a few changes of clothing, her mother's old wooden box now empty of its ring, and the modest savings she had managed to set aside quietly over the past several weeks, sensing perhaps even then that she might need them. She paused once more at the door of the bridal chamber, looking back at the beautifully prepared room, at the 2 rings resting on the pillow, catching the early morning light. She felt no anger in that moment, only a quiet, sorrowful acceptance of what her marriage had already proven itself to be. Whatever love Edmund carried within him clearly belonged to someone else, someone whose memory still called him away even on the night meant to bind him to his new wife. The manor was quiet as Evelyn made her way down the grand staircase, most of the household staff still asleep or only just beginning their morning duties. She moved carefully, avoiding the main hallways where servants might already be stirring, until she reached a smaller side entrance she had noticed during her earlier tour of the grounds. Outside, the morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and distant flowers. Evelyn paused for a moment on the stone steps, looking back at the grand structure of Ravenswood Manor rising behind her, its windows still dark and quiet in the early light. Somewhere within those walls, perhaps, Edmund had finally returned from wherever his grief had carried him, unaware that his bride had already made her decision. She adjusted the trunk in her grip and began walking down the long drive leading away from the manor, her footsteps steady despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She did not know exactly where she would go, only that she could not remain in a house where her presence had been so clearly overshadowed by the memory of another woman. She thought briefly of her Aunt Margaret in Halden Cove, of the quiet coastal town where perhaps a woman with no title and no fortune might still find a way to build some kind of independent life. The long drive stretched on for nearly a mile before reaching the main road, and Evelyn walked the entire distance without pause, her mind strangely clear despite the sleepless night behind her. Birds had begun their morning songs in earnest now, and the sun climbed steadily higher, warming the cool morning air as she walked further and further from the life that had been arranged for her without her consent. By the time she reached the main road and flagged down a passing farmer's cart willing to carry her toward the nearest town with coach service, the sun had fully risen, casting bright, clear light across the countryside. Evelyn settled into the cart, her small trunk beside her, and allowed herself, for the first time since the previous evening, to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had been left alone on her wedding night by a husband whose heart remained bound to a woman, whose portrait hung with careful reverence in his family halls. She had removed her rings and walked away, choosing her own dignity over a marriage built on obligation and unrequited grief. Whatever waited for her now, in Halden Cove or wherever else her path might lead, she understood that she was beginning something entirely new, something built on her own choices rather than the decisions made for her by others. As the cart rolled steadily along the country road, carrying her further from Ravenswood Manor with each passing mile, Evelyn allowed herself finally to release the tears she had held back throughout the long, difficult night. She cried quietly, not from anger, but from the simple, aching sorrow of a hope that had been extinguished before it ever truly had the chance to grow. And beneath that sorrow, faint but unmistakable, she felt the first stirrings of something else entirely, a quiet, resilient strength that would carry her through whatever came next. The journey to Halden Cove took the better part of 2 days, first by farmer's cart to the nearest town with coach service, then by public coach along winding roads that carried Evelyn steadily further from everything familiar. She spent the long hours watching the countryside change outside her window, rolling hills giving way gradually to flatter land, and eventually, the first distant glimpse of gray ocean water stretching toward the horizon. She had sent no word ahead to her aunt, uncertain until the very last moment whether she would actually follow through with her decision to seek refuge there. Part of her had wondered, during the quieter moments of the journey, whether she should simply return home to her father's house instead. But something told her that returning home would only invite questions she was not ready to answer, explanations she was not ready to give, and perhaps even pressure to return to Ravenswood Manor and salvage a marriage she no longer believed could be saved. Halden Cove revealed itself gradually as the coach descended a winding hill road, a small fishing town nestled along a curved bay, its buildings a patchwork of weathered stone and whitewashed wood, smoke rising from chimneys into the cool afternoon air. The scent of salt and fish drifted through the coach windows, mixing with the cries of gulls circling overhead. It felt, to Evelyn's exhausted mind, like arriving in an entirely different world from the grand halls and manicured gardens of her recent life. Her Aunt Margaret's cottage sat near the edge of town, overlooking the harbor, a modest but comfortable home surrounded by a small garden of hardy coastal plants that seemed to thrive despite the constant sea wind. Evelyn walked the short distance from the coach stop, her trunk growing heavier with each step, until she finally reached the familiar blue door and knocked, her heart pounding with uncertainty about what reception awaited her. Margaret opened the door within moments, her expression shifting from surprise to concern the instant she took in her niece's exhausted, disheveled appearance. "Evelyn," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "What on earth has happened?" Evelyn felt the careful composure she had maintained throughout the long journey finally crack. "May I come in, Aunt Margaret?" she managed to say, her voice unsteady. "I have nowhere else to go." Margaret ushered her inside immediately, settling her into a chair beside the small hearth, and calling for tea before Evelyn had even fully removed her traveling cloak. Once seated, wrapped in a warm blanket her aunt had produced from somewhere, Evelyn finally told the whole story, from the wedding ceremony through the long, sleepless night, to the moment she had left the 2 rings on the pillow and walked away. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. When Evelyn finally finished, falling silent and staring into the flickering flames of the hearth, her aunt reached over and took her hand firmly. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "No woman should remain bound to a man who cannot offer her his whole heart, regardless of title or fortune. You have shown more courage in leaving than most women manage in a lifetime of quiet suffering." Evelyn felt tears rising again at her aunt's words, grateful beyond measure for the unwavering support rather than the questions or judgment she had half expected. "What will I do now?" she asked quietly. "I have no fortune of my own, no title anymore, likely no family willing to receive me back given the scandal this will surely cause." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "You will stay here with me, for as long as you need," she said firmly, "and together we will find a path forward that belongs entirely to you." The following weeks brought a period of quiet adjustment as Evelyn settled into the rhythms of life in Halden Cove. The town operated on a schedule entirely different from the formal, ceremonial pace of her previous life, governed instead by tides, fishing seasons, and the practical needs of a working community. Evelyn found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, drawn to this simpler rhythm, finding a kind of peace in tasks that required nothing more complicated than honest effort and attention. Margaret helped her understand that returning to her father's household, at least for now, would likely mean facing tremendous social scrutiny, along with pressure to either reconcile with Edmund or endure the significant scandal that would follow such a public separation. Evelyn had no interest in either option. She wanted, more than anything, distance and time to understand who she might become now that the marriage arranged for her had so completely fallen apart. It was Margaret who first suggested the possibility of taking a position as a governess, drawing on connections she had built over years of living in the coastal community. A prosperous local widow, Mrs. Whitmore, had recently found herself in need of someone to educate her 2 young children following the departure of their previous governess to care for an ailing relative. The position would offer Evelyn modest wages, a comfortable room within the Whitmore household, and perhaps most importantly, a fresh identity separate from the scandal that surely surrounded her name back among the county's nobility. "I could not possibly use my own name," Evelyn said thoughtfully, as she and Margaret discussed the arrangement over tea one evening. "If word reached my father, or worse, reached Ravenswood Manor, it would create difficulties I have no wish to face right now." Margaret nodded in understanding. "Then you shall choose a new one," she said simply. "A fresh start deserves a fresh name, does it not?" After some consideration, Evelyn settled on Nora Fields, a name that felt distant enough from her true identity to offer genuine protection, yet simple enough to feel natural on her tongue. Margaret arranged an introduction with Mrs. Whitmore, presenting Evelyn as a distant family connection recently widowed and in need of respectable employment, a story vague enough to avoid uncomfortable questions while still explaining her circumstances reasonably. Mrs. Whitmore, a warm and practical woman in her middle years, welcomed Nora into her household with genuine kindness, showing little interest in probing further into her past beyond the basic details Margaret had provided. The two children, Alice, aged 9, and Henry, aged 7, proved bright and eager students, quickly warming to their new governess despite her initial nervousness about the unfamiliar role. The early days of teaching brought their own challenges, as Evelyn adjusted to a role entirely different from anything her previous life had prepared her for. She had received a thorough education herself, as was expected for a young woman of her former social standing, but translating that knowledge into effective lessons for two lively, curious children required patience and creativity she had not previously known she possessed. Alice, in particular, took to their lessons with genuine enthusiasm, showing a natural talent for reading and a fierce curiosity about the wider world beyond Halden Cove. Henry proved more restless, preferring outdoor exploration to quiet study, though Evelyn soon discovered that incorporating nature walks and practical mathematics involving counting shells or measuring tide pools kept him engaged far more effectively than traditional lessons ever could. As weeks turned into months, Evelyn found herself settling into a rhythm of life that felt increasingly her own, shaped by her own efforts rather than decisions made on her behalf by others. She rose each morning to prepare lessons, spent her afternoons teaching and exploring the coastal landscape with her young charges, and her evenings often visiting her Aunt Margaret or simply sitting quietly with a book beside her own small window overlooking a modest garden. She thought of Edmund less frequently than she might have expected, though he remained present in quiet moments, particularly when she found herself alone with her thoughts in the evening hours. She wondered sometimes what had become of him, whether he had returned from wherever his grief had carried him on their wedding night, whether he had noticed the rings left behind, whether he had felt any genuine regret over how their brief marriage had ended. She wondered, too, about Charlotte, about whatever story lay behind the laughing portrait and the carefully tended roses. She suspected she would never know the full truth of what had happened between Edmund and the woman whose memory seemed to hold such power over him. Perhaps, she reasoned, it did not matter anymore. Whatever had happened, whatever grief he carried, it had proven itself stronger than any promise he had made to her, and that reality alone was enough to close that particular chapter of her life. Mrs. Whitmore, observing her governess's quiet thoughtfulness during unguarded moments, occasionally asked gentle questions about her past, careful never to press too hard given the vague circumstances Margaret had originally presented. Evelyn found herself grateful for the woman's tactful restraint, offering only the smallest, carefully edited details when questions arose, enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing the true scope of what she had left behind. As autumn deepened into winter, bringing colder winds and shorter days to Halden Cove, Evelyn found her confidence growing steadily alongside her competence in her new role. She had begun teaching Alice and Henry not just their formal lessons, but also small practical skills: how to manage household accounts, how to read the weather patterns that govern the fishing community around them, knowledge she herself had never needed in her previous life, but found genuinely satisfying to learn and share. One evening, as she sat with Margaret beside the crackling hearth, sharing a simple dinner of fish stew and fresh bread, her aunt studied her carefully across the small table. "You seem different than when you first arrived," Margaret observed. "Steadier somehow, more certain of yourself." Evelyn considered the observation thoughtfully before responding. "I believe I am," she admitted. "I never realized how much of my previous life was built around meeting other people's expectations. Here, I have had the chance to discover what I am actually capable of, on my own terms." Margaret smiled warmly, reaching across to squeeze her niece's hand. That, my dear, is perhaps the greatest gift this difficult experience could have offered you, she said, painful as its beginning was. Evelyn nodded slowly, staring into the fire's steady glow. She thought again, briefly, of the rings left behind on the pillow, of the long walk down the Manor's drive in the pale morning light, of the tears she had finally allowed herself during that first coach journey toward an uncertain future. That difficult morning, painful as it had ultimately carried her toward this quiet, meaningful life she was steadily building for herself in Halden Cove. She did not know, as winter settled fully over the small coastal town, that far away at Ravenswood Manor, Edmund Harcourt had spent the months since her departure consumed by a reckoning of his own, one that would eventually set him on a path leading directly back toward the woman he had so carelessly wounded on their wedding night. Edmund had returned to Ravenswood Manor just after 7 in the morning, his horse lathered with sweat, his own body stiff and cold from hours spent sitting alone beside a quiet grave in the small churchyard 3 miles east of the estate. He had not planned to stay away so long. He had told himself, as he mounted his horse the previous night, that he would simply pay his respects quickly and return before his absence could cause any real concern. Instead, he had found himself unable to leave, sitting on the cold ground beside the modest stone marker bearing Charlotte's name, replaying memories that had haunted him for nearly 3 years. He had spoken to her grave the way he sometimes did in his weakest moments, apologizing for the wedding that had just taken place, for the vows he had spoken to another woman, while his heart remained anchored to a promise he had made to Charlotte long before her sudden illness had taken her from him. Charlotte Bennington had been his intended bride once, years before Evelyn had ever entered his life. They had grown up together, their families close friends, their affection deepening naturally from childhood companionship into genuine, heartfelt love. He had proposed to her in the very rose garden Walter still tended with such careful devotion, and she had accepted with the same bright, laughing joy captured forever in the portrait that hung in the Manor's hallway. Their wedding had been planned for the following spring, everything arranged with the same careful attention Evelyn's own wedding had recently received. But 3 months before the ceremony, Charlotte had fallen suddenly ill with a fever that no physician could successfully treat. Edmund had stayed by her bedside through her final weeks, watching helplessly as the vibrant, laughing woman he loved grew weaker with each passing day, until finally, on a cold morning much like the one that had just dawned over Evelyn's own abandoned wedding chamber, Charlotte had passed away. Edmund had never fully recovered from that loss. He had thrown himself into managing the estate, into the responsibilities of his title, using duty as a shield against the grief that threatened to consume him entirely. When his family had eventually pressed him toward marriage again, citing the need for an heir and the continuation of the Harcourt line, he had agreed reluctantly, believing perhaps that duty alone might be enough to sustain a marriage even without the deep love he had once known with Charlotte. He had not anticipated how difficult it would prove to stand before another woman and speak vows nearly identical to those he had once planned to speak to Charlotte. He had not anticipated how strongly her memory would call to him on the very night he was meant to begin a new life with his new wife. Sitting beside her grave through the long hours of that wedding night, Edmund had told himself he simply needed a few moments to say a final goodbye, to release himself from the past so that he might genuinely commit himself to the future waiting for him back at the manor. But dawn had arrived before he found the strength to leave, and by the time he finally mounted his horse for the ride home, guilt had settled heavily over him, understanding fully now the cruelty of what he had done. He had left his new bride alone on their wedding night, chasing the memory of a woman who could never return to him, abandoning the living for the dead in a way that he knew, even as he rode home, was deeply and unforgivably wrong. He arrived at the manor to find the household already stirring with quiet, worried activity. Mrs. Whitfield met him at the entrance, her expression grave, and informed him that Lady Evelyn's chamber appeared to be empty, her small trunk and personal belongings gone, though no one had witnessed her actual departure. Edmund took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, his heart pounding with a dread that had nothing to do with exhaustion from his long night. He pushed open the door of the bridal chamber and found it exactly as Mrs. Whitfield had described, the bed unslept in, Evelyn's trunk gone, her wedding gown draped carefully over a chair as though she had changed with deliberate care rather than fleeing in panic. And there, resting on the pillow where he should have slept beside her, lay 2 rings, his wedding band and a smaller, older ring set with a delicate sapphire stone that he did not recognize. He picked them up slowly, understanding with terrible clarity exactly what they represented. She had removed every symbol of their union and left them behind, a silent, devastating statement that required no accompanying letter to explain. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the rings clutched in his palm, and finally allowed himself to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. He had married a woman who deserved genuine devotion, and had offered her instead a night spent mourning someone else entirely. She had understood, with more clarity than he had managed to find for himself, that their marriage could not survive built upon such an obvious and painful imbalance. The days that followed brought a strange, heavy quiet to Ravenswood Manor. Word of Evelyn's departure spread quickly through the household staff, though careful discretion kept the full details from reaching wider county gossip, at least initially. Edmund found himself unable to focus on estate matters, unable to eat properly, unable to sleep through a single full night without waking suddenly, haunted by the image of the 2 rings resting side by side on that abandoned pillow. He rode out to the small churchyard again several days later, standing before Charlotte's grave with a clarity he had lacked during his previous visit. "I loved you completely," he said quietly, the words carrying away on the cold winter wind. "But you are gone, and I allowed that love to become a weapon I used against someone who never deserved such cruelty." He remained there for a long while, working through thoughts and feelings he had avoided confronting for nearly 3 years. He understood now that his continued mourning, however genuine and understandable in the immediate aftermath of Charlotte's death, had eventually calcified into something less healthy, a refusal to allow himself any possibility of future happiness, a use of grief as protection against ever risking his heart again. Evelyn had walked into a marriage built on obligation, and had found herself competing, without ever fully understanding the terms, against a memory she could never hope to overcome. She had shown more wisdom in recognizing this impossible situation than he had shown in creating it, choosing her own dignity rather than remaining trapped in a marriage destined for quiet, ongoing heartbreak. Returning to the manor, Edmund called for Mrs. Whitfield and questioned her carefully about any information regarding Evelyn's departure, hoping desperately for some clue about where she might have gone. Mrs. Whitfield could offer little beyond confirming that Evelyn had left on foot sometime in the early morning hours, likely making her way toward the main road, where coach services might have carried her toward any number of destinations. Edmund spent the following weeks making careful, discreet inquiries, contacting coach services along the most likely routes, sending letters to acquaintances who might have information about Evelyn's whereabouts without revealing the full scandal of what had transpired. Progress proved frustratingly slow, and as winter deepened, he began to wonder whether he would ever locate her at all, whether she had perhaps deliberately covered her tracks to ensure she would never be found by the husband who had failed her so completely. During this difficult period of searching, Edmund also began the slower, more internal work of genuinely processing his grief for Charlotte in a healthier way. He spoke with the local vicar, a thoughtful and patient man named Reverend Aldridge, about the nature of loss and the difference between honoring a memory and allowing that memory to prevent any possibility of future happiness. Grief does not require you to remain forever frozen in the moment of your loss, Reverend Aldridge told him during one particular visit. Honoring someone's memory means carrying the best of what they taught you forward into your continuing life, not refusing to live fully in their absence. The words settled deeply within Edmund, offering him a new framework for understanding his own behavior over the past several years. He began visiting Charlotte's grave less frequently, though never entirely abandoning the practice, finding instead small ways to honor her memory that did not require him to remain trapped in unresolved mourning. He established a small fund in her name to support the local orphanage she had always cared deeply about during her lifetime, a gesture that felt genuinely meaningful rather than merely symbolic. Slowly, as winter began its gradual retreat towards spring, Edmund's inquiries finally yielded a promising lead. A coach driver, questioned carefully by one of Edmund's trusted associates, recalled carrying a young woman matching Evelyn's description toward a coastal town several counties away. A woman traveling alone with a single small trunk, her manner quiet and composed despite obvious signs of recent distress. The coastal town, the driver recalled after some consideration, had been called Halden Cove. Edmund felt something shift within him upon hearing the name, a mixture of hope and renewed determination that had been largely absent from his life since Evelyn's departure. He understood that locating her would not automatically resolve the significant harm he had caused, that any reconciliation, should it even be possible, would require genuine effort and demonstrated change rather than simple apology alone. He began preparing carefully for the journey ahead, understanding that arriving at Halden Cove unannounced, demanding immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, would likely accomplish nothing beyond causing Evelyn further distress. Instead, he resolved to approach the situation with patience and humility, prepared to accept whatever outcome resulted from finally confronting the consequences of his actions on their wedding night. Before departing, Edmund made one final visit to Charlotte's grave, standing quietly before the familiar stone marker as the first genuine warmth of early spring touched the churchyard around him. "I am not leaving you behind," he said softly. "I am simply learning, finally, how to carry your memory without letting it prevent me from living the rest of my life honestly. I hope, somehow, you would understand that difference." He turned from the grave and walked back toward his waiting horse with a lighter step than he had managed in longer than he could clearly remember, ready finally to begin the journey that would determine whether any genuine future remained possible with the woman whose quiet strength and dignity had, even in her absence, taught him more about the true nature of love and respect than he had managed to learn in all his years of careful, guarded grief. The journey to Halden Cove took Edmund the better part of 3 days, traveling by horse rather than coach, needing the physical activity of the ride to steady his nerves as the distance between himself and the small coastal town gradually shrank. He had sent no advance word of his coming, uncertain even now exactly what he would say when he finally found Evelyn, only trusting that the right words would come to him once he stood before her again. He arrived in the early afternoon of the 3rd day, the town revealing itself much as the coach driver had described. A modest collection of stone and whitewashed buildings clustered around a curved harbor, fishing boats bobbing gently against the docks, the air thick with salt and the cries of circling gulls. Edmund found lodging at the town's single small inn, and began making careful, discreet inquiries about a young woman matching Evelyn's description who might have arrived in the town sometime during the previous autumn. The innkeeper, a weathered older man with little patience for gossip but genuine local knowledge, suggested Edmund might find useful information at the small church near the town center, where the vicar tended to know most newcomers to the community. Edmund followed the suggestion, walking the short distance through narrow, winding streets until he located the modest stone church and its adjoining vicarage. The vicar, a kindly man named Reverend Hale, listened patiently as Edmund explained, in carefully edited terms, that he was searching for a family relation who might have recently settled in the area. Reverend Hale considered the description thoughtfully before mentioning that a young widow named Nora Fields had indeed arrived in Halden Cove during the previous autumn, currently employed as a governess for the Whitmore family on the northern edge of town. Edmund felt his heart quicken at the description, though the unfamiliar name gave him pause. "Nora Fields," he repeated carefully. "Might you describe her, Reverend?" Reverend Hale offered a general description: brown hair, quiet manner, careful and thoughtful in her speech, Details that matched Evelyn closely enough that Edmund felt certain he had found her, despite the assumed name. He thanked the vicar sincerely and made his way toward the Whitmore residence, his pulse racing with a combination of anticipation and genuine nervousness he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. The Whitmore house sat on a gentle rise overlooking the harbor, a comfortable but modest residence surrounded by a well-kept garden. Edmund paused at the gate for a long moment, gathering his composure, before finally approaching the front door and requesting to speak with the lady of the house. Mrs. Whitmore received him in her sitting room with polite curiosity, clearly unaccustomed to visits from strangers of obvious noble bearing. Edmund introduced himself honestly, explaining that he believed her current governess might be a family connection he had lost touch with under difficult circumstances, and asked, as carefully and respectfully as he could manage, whether he might have a brief conversation with her. Mrs. Whitmore studied him thoughtfully for a long moment before agreeing to send for Nora, though she made clear that she would remain nearby throughout any conversation, unwilling to allow a stranger unsupervised access to a woman under her household's protection. Edmund appreciated the caution, understanding it reflected well on the character of the household that had taken Evelyn in during her time of need. The wait for Evelyn to appear felt endless, though it likely lasted only a few minutes in reality. Edmund stood near the sitting room window, watching the garden outside, rehearsing and discarding various opening statements, none of which felt adequate to the magnitude of what he needed to say. When the door finally opened and Evelyn stepped into the room, Edmund felt something catch painfully in his chest. She looked different from the pale, nervous bride he remembered from their wedding day, her posture straighter, her expression steadier, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that had clearly grown during her months of independent living. She stopped abruptly upon seeing him, her eyes widening with visible shock before her expression settled into something more carefully guarded. "Edmund," she said quietly, her voice controlled despite the obvious surprise. "I did not expect to see you here." Mrs. Whitmore, sensing the significance of the moment, quietly excused herself to the adjoining room, leaving the door open enough to maintain propriety while offering them a measure of privacy for their conversation. "I know I have no right to simply appear like this," Edmund began carefully, his rehearsed words feeling inadequate now that he stood before her directly. "But I needed to see you to explain, if you would allow me, and to apologize properly for what I did." Evelyn remained standing near the doorway, her expression difficult to read. "You left our wedding night to visit a grave," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of remembered hurt. "I learned that much before I left. There is little more explanation needed." Edmund nodded slowly, accepting the accusation without defense. "You are right that no explanation excuses what I did," he agreed. "But I would still like the chance to tell you the truth, if you are willing to hear it. Not to ask for anything from you, only to be honest, finally, in a way I failed to be honest with you before our marriage even began." Something in his tone, perhaps the genuine humility rather than practiced charm, seemed to soften Evelyn's guarded expression slightly. She moved further into the room and settled into a chair near the window, gesturing for him to take the seat opposite her. "Then tell me," she said simply. Edmund spent the next half-hour explaining everything, Charlotte's story from their childhood friendship through their engagement, her sudden illness and death, and the years of unprocessed grief that had followed. He explained his family's pressure toward remarriage, his own mistaken belief that duty alone might be sufficient to build a marriage even without genuine emotional availability, and finally, the terrible mistake of visiting Charlotte's grave on the very night he should have been building a new life with his actual wife. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression shifting through several emotions as the story unfolded: surprise, understanding, and something that might have been sympathy, though carefully guarded against too readily forgiving what remained, ultimately, a significant betrayal of the vows they had spoken together. When Edmund finally finished, silence settled over the room for a long moment before Evelyn spoke. "I am sorry for your loss," she said quietly and genuinely. Charlotte's death sounds like it caused you real and lasting pain, and I understand grief does not follow convenient timelines. But Edmund, she continued, her voice gaining firmness, understanding your reasons does not erase what happened. You married me while your heart remained entirely elsewhere. You allowed me to walk into a union built on false pretenses, believing perhaps that duty alone could sustain what should have required genuine partnership. I know, Edmund said quietly. I understand that completely now, perhaps more clearly than I have understood anything in years. I'm not here to ask you to simply forgive and forget, or to immediately return to a marriage that failed so completely from its very beginning. I only wish to be honest with you, finally, about everything I failed to share before, and to tell you that I have spent these months since your departure trying to understand and correct the mistakes that led to that terrible night. Evelyn studied him carefully, searching his face for the sincerity behind his words. What has changed, then? She asked directly. If I were to consider any possibility of reconciliation, what assurance would I have that history would not simply repeat itself? Edmund considered the question seriously before answering. I cannot offer guarantees, he said honestly. I can only tell you that I have spent real, difficult effort confronting grief I had avoided processing for years. I have found healthier ways to honor Charlotte's memory that do not require me to remain trapped in mourning at the expense of any future happiness. And I have come to understand, through losing you, exactly how much genuine partnership matters, something I clearly failed to appreciate when our marriage first began. Evelyn remained quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I have built a life here, she said finally. A quiet one, but genuinely my own, built on my own efforts and choices rather than decisions made on my behalf by others. I am not certain I am willing to simply set that aside, even for the possibility of a corrected marriage. I am not asking you to set anything aside, Edmund said quickly. I only wished for the chance to be honest with you, and to let you know that whatever choice you make now, whether that includes any place for me or not, comes entirely from your own genuine will rather than any obligation. That much, at least, I owe you. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her careful expression. I will need time to consider what you have told me, she said eventually. This is not a decision I am prepared to make in a single conversation. Edmund nodded immediately, relief evident in his expression despite the lack of any firm resolution. Take whatever time you need, he said sincerely. I will not press you, and I will not return uninvited to disrupt the life you have built here. I only ask that if you are willing at some point to speak further, that you might send word, and I will come immediately, whatever the hour or distance. He rose to leave, pausing once more at the door to look back at her, still seated calmly near the window, the afternoon light illuminating her steady, thoughtful expression. Whatever you decide, Evelyn, he said quietly, I am genuinely grateful for the chance to finally be honest with you, even this late, and even knowing it may not be enough to change what has already happened between us. Evelyn watched him go, listening to his footsteps retreating down the hallway and eventually the sound of the front door closing behind him. She remained seated for a long while afterward, staring out at the garden beyond the window, turning over everything he had shared, weighing the genuine sincerity she had sensed in his words against the very real hurt his actions had caused her. She did not yet know what her final answer would be. But for the first time since that painful morning when she had left her rings behind and walked away from Ravenswood Manor, she found herself genuinely considering the possibility that some form of reconciliation, built now on honesty rather than obligation, might actually be possible between them. The days following Edmund's visit passed slowly for Evelyn, her mind returning again and again to their conversation, despite her best efforts to focus on her usual routines with Alice and Henry. She found herself distracted during lessons, staring out the schoolroom window toward the harbor, her thoughts drifting toward Ravenswood Manor and the complicated man who had once been, however briefly, her husband. Margaret noticed the change in her niece almost immediately, and one evening, over their usual simple dinner, she finally asked directly what had been troubling her. Evelyn hesitated only briefly before telling her aunt about Edmund's visit, sharing the full explanation he had offered about Charlotte, about his years of unprocessed grief, and about his sincere, careful apology for the pain he had caused on their wedding night. Margaret listened thoughtfully, her expression difficult to read until Evelyn finished speaking. "And what do you feel hearing all of this?" she asked finally. "I do not know," Evelyn admitted honestly. "Part of me understands his grief, truly understands it, having lost my own mother, and knowing how deeply such loss can shape a person. But another part of me remains hurt, remembering that long, lonely night waiting for a husband who never came, understanding now that he chose a grave over the living woman he had just promised to honor." "Both feelings can be true simultaneously," Margaret said gently. "Understanding someone's pain does not obligate you to excuse the harm that pain caused you. The question is not whether his grief was genuine, which it clearly was, but whether you believe he has truly changed enough to offer you a real partnership now, should you choose to consider it." Evelyn nodded slowly, appreciating her aunt's characteristically direct wisdom. "And if I decide I do not wish to return to him at all," she asked, "would that decision be reasonable, given everything that happened?" "Entirely reasonable," Margaret said firmly. "You owe him nothing, regardless of his changed circumstances or sincere apology. Whatever choice you make must come from your own genuine desire, not from any sense of obligation toward fixing what he broke." The conversation offered Evelyn little immediate clarity, though it helped her understand more clearly the shape of the decision before her. Over the following weeks, she continued her regular duties with the Whitmore children while allowing herself, in quiet moments, to genuinely consider what she actually wanted for her future, separate from any pressure or expectation from either her family or from Edmund himself. She thought often about the life she had built in Halden Cove, modest but genuinely her own, filled with small daily satisfactions that had nothing to do with titles or grand estates. She had grown to love her work with Alice and Henry, had developed genuine friendships within the small coastal community, had discovered capabilities within herself that her previous sheltered life had never given her opportunity to explore. She also, however, found herself remembering the brief moments of genuine connection she and Edmund had shared before their wedding, the softness in his expression as he walked her to her carriage after that quiet dinner, the honest vulnerability in his voice as he had explained Charlotte's story during his visit to the Whitmore household. Whatever mistakes he had made, she sensed a fundamental decency beneath his guarded exterior, one that perhaps, given genuine effort and honest partnership, might actually be capable of building the kind of respectful, caring marriage she had once hoped for. Nearly a month after Edmund's visit, Evelyn finally decided she was ready to see him again, though not yet with any firm decision about reconciliation. She wrote a brief letter, careful and measured, inviting him to return to Halden Cove so they might continue their conversation, though making clear that this invitation carried no promise of any particular outcome. Edmund arrived within 4 days of receiving her letter, his eagerness evident despite his obvious efforts to maintain a composed, patient demeanor. They met this time not at the Whitmore household, but at a small tea house near the harbor, a neutral location Evelyn had specifically chosen to signal that this conversation existed outside the formal structures of their previous life together. "You look well," Edmund said as they settled into their seats, the harbor visible through the window beside them, fishing boats bobbing gently in the afternoon light. "Thank you," Evelyn replied. "I have had a month to think carefully about everything you shared with me." Edmund nodded, his expression attentive and slightly nervous. "And what conclusions have you reached?" he asked carefully. Evelyn took a moment before answering, choosing her words with deliberate care. "I believe your grief for Charlotte was genuine," she said. "And I believe, from what I observed during your recent visit, that you have made real efforts to process that grief in healthier ways. I do not doubt your sincerity in seeking me out and offering your honest apology." Edmund waited, sensing there was more to come, careful not to interrupt her careful reasoning. But Evelyn continued, "I also believe that trust, once broken so completely, cannot simply be restored through a single conversation or apology. however genuine. If we were to consider any path toward reconciliation, it would need to be built slowly, through demonstrated consistency over time, not through immediate return to the marriage as it previously existed. Edmund felt something like relief mixed with continued uncertainty at her words, understanding that she had not entirely closed the door on their relationship, though she had also made clear that any path forward would require significant, sustained effort on his part. "I understand completely," he said sincerely, "and I am genuinely willing to demonstrate whatever consistency and patience you require for however long that process takes. I do not expect, nor do I believe I deserve, immediate restoration of the trust I broke so carelessly." They spent the following hour discussing practical possibilities, Evelyn making clear that she had no intention of abandoning her position with the Whitmore family or her independent life in Halden Cove for the foreseeable future, regardless of what happened between them personally. Edmund agreed readily, expressing genuine respect for the life she had built and no desire to pressure her into abandoning it prematurely. "Perhaps," Evelyn suggested carefully, "we might correspond regularly, and you might visit periodically, allowing us to genuinely know each other in ways our rushed original courtship never permitted. If over time, that process builds toward something resembling trust and genuine partnership, we can consider what a renewed marriage might actually look like. But I will not rush this process for the sake of convenience or reputation, regardless of what pressure either of our families might apply." Edmund agreed immediately and completely, understanding that this careful, deliberate approach offered the only realistic path toward genuinely repairing what his earlier mistakes had damaged. "That arrangement seems entirely reasonable," he said, "and honestly, Evelyn, more generous than I likely deserve given how our marriage began." Over the following months, their careful correspondence and periodic visits gradually built something neither of them had experienced during their brief, rushed original courtship: genuine familiarity built through honest conversation rather than formal politeness. Edmund shared more openly about his ongoing efforts to process his grief in healthier ways, including his work establishing the orphanage fund in Charlotte's memory, while Evelyn shared stories of her daily life with Alice and Henry, of the small satisfactions and occasional frustrations of her independent work. Slowly, through this patient process, something resembling genuine affection began growing between them, built now on actual knowledge of each other's character rather than the arranged obligation that had originally brought them together. Evelyn found herself looking forward to Edmund's visits with genuine anticipation rather than dutiful acceptance, appreciating the thoughtful, considerate man who emerged through their ongoing correspondence, quite different from the guarded, distant figure she had first encountered before their wedding. Nearly a year after that painful morning when she had left her rings behind and walked away from Ravenswood Manor, Evelyn found herself, during one of Edmund's regular visits, genuinely considering whether she might finally be ready to consider a renewed commitment between them. They sat together in Margaret's small garden, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink, and Edmund, sensing perhaps the shift in her demeanor, spoke carefully. "I do not wish to rush you," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, about our future or about continuing simply as we are now, I remain genuinely grateful for the chance you have given me to demonstrate real change, rather than simply accepting my apology at face value." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, comparing this patient, honest man before her with the distant, guarded stranger she had married under obligation more than a year earlier. "I believe," she said finally, choosing her words with careful deliberation, "that I am ready to consider a genuine future together, built this time on our own choices rather than family obligation, and on honest partnership rather than unspoken grief." Edmund's expression shifted with visible, genuine emotion at her words, though he maintained his careful composure, sensing that this remained her decision to shape rather than his to celebrate prematurely. "What would that future look like?" he asked carefully, "to you?" Evelyn considered the question thoughtfully. "I would want to maintain some independence," she said. "Perhaps not continuing exactly as governess to the Whitmore children forever, but maintaining connections to this community and to interests entirely my own, separate from simply being Countess of Ravenswood. I would want genuine partnership in managing our household and estate matters, not simply deference to your decisions alone. And I would want us to continue exactly this kind of honest communication we have built these past months, regardless of how comfortable or established our marriage eventually becomes. Edmund nodded seriously, considering each point with genuine attention rather than automatic agreement. All of that seems not only reasonable but genuinely important, he said. I want a real partner, Evelyn, not simply a dutiful wife managing my household while I remain distant and unavailable. I understand now, more clearly than I ever did before losing you, exactly what kind of marriage I actually want to build, and everything you have described aligns completely with that understanding. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the last colors of sunset fade from the sky above the harbor. Finally, Edmund reached into his coat and withdrew a small box, opening it carefully to reveal both rings, his original wedding band and Evelyn's mother's sapphire ring, which he had kept safely with him throughout the entire process of searching for her and slowly rebuilding their connection. I have carried these with me since that morning, he said quietly, not to pressure you toward any particular decision, but because I understood they represented something important that I hoped, eventually, we might genuinely rebuild together, rather than simply restore to their original, hollow meaning. Evelyn looked at the rings resting in the small box, remembering clearly the moment she had placed them on that abandoned pillow, choosing her own dignity over a marriage built on false pretenses. Now, looking at them again after a year of honest effort and genuine growth on both their parts, she felt something entirely different. A sense that these same rings might now represent something real rather than merely obligatory. She reached out and took the sapphire ring first, her mother's ring, sliding it onto her finger where it had rested during those difficult early days of their original arrangement. Then, after a moment's genuine consideration, she picked up the wedding band as well, looking directly at Edmund with clear, steady eyes. I am ready, she said simply, to build this marriage properly, this time on our own terms. Edmund took the ring gently from her hand and slid it back onto her finger, this time with none of the trembling uncertainty that had marked their original wedding day, but instead with the steady confidence of a man who genuinely understood and valued what he was committing himself to. The gesture carried none of the rushed obligation of their first ceremony, representing instead a choice made freely and deliberately by two people who had each grown significantly through the difficult journey that had brought them back together. As the last light faded from the harbor beyond Margaret's small garden, Evelyn and Edmund sat together, no longer strangers bound by arrangement and unspoken grief, but two people who had chosen each other honestly, through patience, growth, and genuine partnership, ready finally to build the kind of marriage that neither obligation nor tragedy had been able to create between them the first time around. Their second wedding, held nearly 18 months after that first painful ceremony, looked nothing like the grand, formal affair that had originally bound them together under obligation. Evelyn insisted on a small gathering, held in the modest chapel at Halden Cove rather than the imposing stone church near Ravenswood Manor, with only close family and a handful of genuine friends in attendance. Margaret stood proudly beside her niece as she prepared for the ceremony, helping arrange a simple, elegant gown far less elaborate than the ivory silk creation from their first wedding. This time, Evelyn had chosen every detail herself, without the pressure of family expectation or financial desperation shaping her decisions. Mrs. Whitmore attended as well, along with Alice and Henry, who had grown genuinely fond of their governess over the 18 months of her employment, and remained determined to witness her happiness even as she prepared to eventually step back from her formal teaching duties. Evelyn had promised both children that she would remain closely involved in their lives regardless of her changing circumstances, a promise she fully intended to keep given how much their friendship had meant to her during her time of rebuilding. Edmund's family attended as well, though in smaller numbers than the grand original ceremony, his elderly uncle offering genuine congratulations this time rather than simply fulfilling social obligation. Even Reverend Aldridge traveled from the county near Ravenswood Manor to witness the ceremony. Having played his own quiet role in helping, Edmund worked through his grief during the difficult months of searching for Evelyn. The ceremony itself felt entirely different from their first rushed wedding day. Edmund's voice remained steady and clear as he spoke his vows, no trembling hesitation marking his promises this time, his eyes meeting Evelyn's directly and honestly throughout the entire exchange. Evelyn felt none of the nervous uncertainty that had marked her first wedding day, instead experiencing a calm, genuine confidence in the choice she was making, understanding fully now exactly what kind of man she was committing herself to and exactly what kind of partnership they had built together. Following the ceremony, they returned together to Ravenswood Manor, though this time as genuine partners rather than strangers bound by arrangement. Evelyn walked through the grand halls with new eyes, no longer intimidated by the imposing portraits or elaborate formal rooms, understanding now the full history behind the careful rose garden and the laughing portrait that still hung, respectfully, in its familiar place along the hallway. She had asked Edmund, during their months of careful courtship, whether the portrait troubled him to keep displayed so prominently, and he had explained honestly that he wished to honor Charlotte's memory openly rather than hiding it away as though it were something shameful. Evelyn had come to understand and even appreciate this decision, recognizing that acknowledging his past honestly, rather than pretending it did not exist, represented exactly the kind of genuine growth that had made their renewed relationship possible in the first place. Life at Ravenswood Manor settled into a rhythm neither of them had experienced during their first brief attempt at marriage. Evelyn took genuine interest in estate matters, working alongside Edmund rather than simply deferring to his decisions, her practical experience managing the Whitmore household and her own independent finances proving genuinely valuable as she took on greater responsibility within their shared household. She maintained her connection to Halden Cove as well, visiting regularly to see Margaret and to check on Alice and Henry's continued education under their new governess, a young woman Evelyn herself had helped select and train before her own departure from the position. The coastal town remained important to her, a reminder of the strength and independence she had discovered within herself during her months of quiet exile, qualities she had no intention of abandoning simply because her circumstances had changed once again. Edmund, for his part, continued his ongoing work honoring Charlotte's memory through the orphanage fund he had established, expanding it over time into a genuinely significant charitable effort that provided real support to children throughout the county who had lost their own parents. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this continued charitable work alongside his renewed marriage to Evelyn did not create the conflict he might once have feared, but instead felt entirely complementary, honoring his past honestly while building genuinely toward his future. 2 years after their second wedding, Evelyn gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Charlotte Margaret Harcourt, honoring both the woman whose memory had once nearly destroyed their chance at happiness, and the aunt whose quiet wisdom and support had helped Evelyn rebuild her life during the most difficult period of her journey. Edmund held his newborn daughter with visible, overwhelming emotion, understanding fully the significance of the name they had chosen together, a deliberate acknowledgement that grief and love could genuinely coexist without one destroying the other, when approached with honesty and genuine effort rather than avoidance or denial. Watching her husband hold their daughter that evening, Evelyn found herself thinking back to that painful morning, when she had left 2 rings behind on an untouched pillow and walked away from everything that marriage had originally represented. She understood now, with the clarity that only genuine growth and hard-won happiness could provide, that leaving had been absolutely necessary, not as an ending, but as the essential first step toward building something entirely different and infinitely more genuine than what had existed between them before. Their marriage, forged now through honesty, patience, and genuine mutual respect rather than obligation and unspoken grief, continued to strengthen through the years that followed. They faced ordinary challenges together, as all genuine partnerships eventually do: disagreements over estate management, the ordinary stresses of raising children, occasional visits from family members who still remembered the scandal of their original, failed first wedding night. But they faced these challenges as genuine equals, communicating honestly rather than retreating into guarded silence, building steadily upon the foundation they had so carefully and deliberately constructed during their long months apart. Years later, when their daughter Charlotte was old enough to ask about the family history that occasionally surfaced in overheard conversations among older relatives, Evelyn found herself telling the full story honestly, explaining how she had once left her rings behind and walked away from a marriage built on false pretenses, and how that difficult, painful choice had ultimately led toward a genuine, hard-won happiness that she would never have discovered had she simply remained trapped in a marriage that could not have survived its own broken foundation. Sometimes, she told her daughter, the most important thing a person can do is walk away from something broken, not out of anger or spite, but out of genuine respect for oneself and a belief that something better, something built on honesty and genuine partnership, remains possible even when the immediate path forward feels completely uncertain. Charlotte listened carefully to her mother's story, understanding even at her young age that the tale carried genuine wisdom beyond its specific details, a lesson about courage, about self-respect, and about the patient, deliberate work required to build genuine trust after it has been broken. It was a story she would carry with her throughout her own life, a reminder passed down from a mother who had once found the strength to leave her rings behind on an empty pillow and walk into an uncertain future, trusting that her own dignity and self-worth mattered more than any title or arrangement that failed to honor them properly. And so the story of Evelyn Ashworth and Edmund Harcourt, which had begun with such painful betrayal on their original wedding night, ultimately became instead a story of genuine redemption, patient healing, and the kind of hard-won love that can only be built when two people choose honesty over convenience, and genuine partnership over empty obligation, no matter how difficult or uncertain that choice might initially appear.